Hey, I want to thank the organizers for accepting my abstract here because my research isn't statistical. It's a qualitative piece of work. But the relevance is in a few directions. One, there's always a story behind the numbers. And so we can do deductive guesses about what's going on, and then there's inductive approaches to it. I'd like to focus on the latter. Also, the focus of this symposium, this conference, is health inequalities in policy. And I'd certainly like to address those questions, focusing on the topic of health and safety and temporary agency workers. This is research that I've done together with my colleagues Ron Saunders, Catherine Lapel, Elizabeth Mansfield, and Christine Carrasco. Oh, okay. So I mentioned, just forewarning, it's not a statistical study, but with the type of research that I'm doing with the qualitative methods, we're looking at structural incentives for behavior that govern behavior. So we don't know the frequency of how often things are happening, but we can see the incentives set in place and the logic of behavior. What is the rationale that is offered systematically for behaving in certain ways? I'm also going to talk in this presentation about the implications for practice when policy is not updated or poorly updated, even after changes in society and the way we organize things. Sometimes it's just oversight, and sometimes it seems like there's active negligence. So the context for my talk is temporary agency work sector. It's a sector that's really growing internationally, in Canada too. It's an increasingly established part of the labor market now, where employers want to be more flexible and to hire people at will here and there for when they need them. In Canada, the employment services sector was $11.5 billion in 2012 Statistics Canada numbers. I don't know the percentage in Quebec. In Ontario, where my study was based, is half of the revenue. And we used to think about people working in temporary work agencies as like the Kelly girl, someone coming in to earn a little bit of extra money to replace someone who's on maternity leave. But most of us are familiar now with temporary agency workers taking on a more permanent role in organizations. Sometimes we even hear the word perma-temp. And so they're becoming a strategic part of clients' workforces. The challenge with temporary work agencies is it offers kind of a different form of employment. Instead of one boss, you have two. You have two employers. You have the agency who's employing you, and then you have the site where you're placed to work with the employer there. And under different legal regulations, there's different understandings of who the employer is. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing mostly on workers' compensation legislation in Ontario, where the temporary agency is considered to be the sole employer. Under other legislation in Ontario, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, if there's a fatality or a very severe injury, that act would be focused more on the situation, and then there would be a shared responsibility. So one of the challenges in relation to health for temporary agency work is that it's risky. Basically, across international jurisdictions, across studies, we see that if you're a worker from a temporary work agency, you have a higher chance of getting hurt. And so there are lots of ideas. Why? What's the mechanism behind the high injury risk? In Ontario, when we began this study, we were looking at workers' compensation board, insurance premiums. If you have a lower than expected accident rate, the employers get a big rebate back on their experience-rated premiums. And there is a group of temporary agency workers who formed a safety group together, and they're getting big rebates. They're saying, wow, internationally, the accident rate is so high for temporary agency workers. So why do the Ontario temporary agencies seem to be so safe compared to the international trend? So that was one of our questions. We wanted to know about the process then of how do they do health and safety for temporary agency workers. So the study was qualitative. We wanted to know how temporary agencies are organized. How do they send the workers out? What are the contracts like? What are the relationships like? And the main focus was how do they do injury prevention and return to work? And what is the context in law and policy? And so my colleague Catherine Lapel was the one who led the initiative on the latter part. We were looking specifically at the low-skilled temporary agency workers and then the types of workplaces that they went to and type of agencies that they used. Now you can be a senior executive and work through a temporary agency, and nurses and teachers can get these jobs. But we were focusing really on people who were getting work in factories and the lower skill general labor. So in our sample for interviews, and you know with qualitative research you tend to have purposeful samples, so it's a smaller, it's not statistically generalizable, but it's a carefully chosen sample. You really are looking for people who are on the inside, who can really explain systematically how they have seen how things work. So we had 19 workers. We talked to 12 client employers across 11 workplaces that were the types of employers where the workers described being sent. We talked to people who manage work in temporary work agencies, 22 interviews there. And we covered the multinational agencies all the way down to small. As well, we wanted to talk to key informants, the people who, on the inside in terms of policy making, health and safety inspectors, representatives from the temporary agency industry, and from worker advocacy centers where people come for help. And the study was guided by a multi-stakeholder advisory committee who helped us to think about the appropriateness of our questions and design and our interpretations. So, coming to the findings, I'm going to be giving you some quotes just to illustrate some of the data that we were finding. One of the first things that became clear to us was how people from different directions were talking about how workers were being hired for relatively dangerous, dirty work. So not to say that all temporary agency workers are always hired for dirty work, but this is included in part of what they do. So here's an employer who explains the logic of why he employs workers from the agencies. He says, I'll hire a couple of guys for half a day to unload the container loaded with goods. It's just heavy-duty work that I'd rather not have my guys doing. And here's a health and safety inspector who describes that kind of scenario that he would see also. A company in Ontario bought a load of lumber. They open it, they find the material was stored unsafely. Instead of sending their workers then, they get a temporary agency. The two workers, when the doors were open, they were handling the material, the load came apart and killed the guy. So a little bit of risk shifting going on here that's made possible by these relationships. The challenge is, though, that agencies actually have little control over the employees' work conditions. So even though for the purposes of the Workers' Compensation Board, they're the sole employer, they're not there. They just send the worker miles away to go work for someone else. It's an unusual relationship when you're the one that's responsible for the accident statistics. So here's a multinational who says, we have a responsibility from an oversight standpoint, but we don't manage the workforce. We don't own the building or the equipment. And here's just a guy who's the owner of a small agency describing the same type of scenario. I'm not out with my 140 people who are working. Right now, I can't see what they're being exposed to today. I don't know that the person who was hired to put screws in a bag isn't operating a punch press machine with no guards on it. Maybe the customer told me in good faith that we're going to use those guys to put screws in the bag. But, oh shit, the guy operating the CNC lathe isn't there today. So Bruno, come over here. So basically these workers are there to make life convenient for the client employers that they're sent for. And everyone knows that in workplaces, the day doesn't always unfold predictably, and new things come up. So the challenge here, the interesting thing is that the temporary agencies are liable for huge costs for worker injuries. So in Workers' Compensation, Workplace Safety and Insurance Board in Quebec, here's the CSST, They say in the supply of labor industry, it's the agency supplying and paying the worker, not the employer to whom the worker that is supplied is responsible for covering the agency's workers under this act. And so with experience-rated premiums that are common across North America and other jurisdictions, if the agency sends their workers out and they have a lot of accidents, their premiums are going to go up high, and it really is a significant cost for the businesses. Very important. So this is a challenge. The idea with these financial incentives is that it's supposed to encourage employers to keep their workers safe. So you have fewer accidents, you have lower insurance rates. That's the idea. But we have a perverse situation here, where the agencies are sending workers out, they don't control the site, but they bear the cost. Why do they seem to invite accidents and costs? So, of course, we explored, and we talked, as you saw with the sample, to a lot of agencies themselves. Have you managed to make everything safe? Like, are you controlling the situation? Not that we could see in this study. We found from all parties that they talked about providing workers with basic prevention training, like how to lift boxes, but they can't manage the exposures on the work site. And across our participants, they talked about special risks being present. Workers being new on the job, they can't find things, they're stumbling around, they're trying to prove themselves because they really need the job, so they're working hard. They talked about getting the heavy or the dirty work a lot. Like if 2 trucks come in and one has all the heavy boxes, it's the temp agency workers that's going to unload the heavy boxes in the truck. Local staff who don't even like the temporary agency workers being there, especially if it's a unionized environment, so they're not telling them where things are, how to help, how to do things. And then even if there is a problem, maybe workers are working at a height, they could fall off and there's no guard. The agency, they can just say, oh, please can you put up the gate there? Because it's not their workplace. And then what if the employer doesn't? Does the agency want to withdraw everyone and lose the contract? So it's a challenge. So we identified from our study 4 main explanations for this situation. One is agencies were accepting this risk because risk is their market. When agencies are listed as the sole employer, it's in some ways to their advantage in creating a market because the accidents don't show on their record. Here's an agency owner who explains it quite nicely. We were providing industrial labor to a client. The client was receiving a workers' compensation award. That day, I had 2 people rolled out the back door to an ambulance. The client kept his health and safety record up high because he outsourced to staffing agencies all the risky jobs, all the heaviest lifting, all the jobs that required any kind of dangerous work went to the staffing agency. So his workers' compensation record looked perfect. So this arrangement, this policy arrangement, this legal arrangement, gives business to the temporary agencies, but it also provides an incentive for client employers to hire the agencies for dangerous work. It also hides the injury location. Also, if we look at how experience rating works behind the scenes, you see the temporary agencies have a financial advantage. In yellow, do I push it in the middle? Yeah. So up here, for supply of non-clerical labor, that's the rate group for temporary agencies. So for every $100 of payroll, it's $4.83. You send workers out to a warehouse, unload boxes, and their rate is $2 more for every $100 of payroll. So that means the cost of employing workers directly in the warehouse is more expensive, and the cost of accidents is cheaper. Much better to fill the warehouse with all of these people. It's cheaper. Even if temporary agency workers do get hurt, the agencies have a lighter cost obligation than a company that would hire the workers themselves. You have to re-employ workers when they're hurt, after they're hurt, but the obligation is only if you've employed the workers for at least 12 months. But temporary agencies rarely have someone employed for 12 months. Even if they do, they use term and task contracts, short-term discontinuous. Let's just say somehow an agency did have that obligation. Under the policy, they don't really have to give them their job back. They just have to put them back on the list of being available. So their obligation compared to other employers in policy and in law is lighter. And yet, these workers seem to face a lot of risks. The agencies we saw also how they groomed vulnerable workers not to complain. We were looking specifically at low-skill, low-wage workers. The workers in our sample were the type that were working for agencies because they had no other choice. They had criminal records, addiction problems. They were new to Canada, no job experience. And they could be influenced to not report accidents because really they're very insecure with their employment. So here's a quote from an international agency, very well-known name, we would all recognize it. He talked about their strategy for claim suppression. They came in, you fill in a 15-page accident report. We see a lot of people taking advantage of the system. If I get hurt at work, they're still going to pay me. So sometimes I had people come in, they fill in the paperwork, and they're like, oh my goodness, if it wasn't a serious accident, I would leave now. So you can see how you make them fill out too much paperwork, and then things don't get filled. And there are other strategies as well, including workers who are so worried about never being asked back because it's an insecure contract that they hide their own injuries and don't tell anyone because they need the job. So we go to the policymakers. We say, why doesn't the temporary agency sector try to remove this financial responsibility when they can't control the risk? Wouldn't it be in their interest? And so here's one of our policymakers who said, well, employers have a financial incentive to go through the temp agency. They're not lobbying because it doesn't make financial sense to do so, even though from a health and safety point of view, it might be logical. That's the way it goes. Another regulator asked the same question. He said, I think injury responsibility could be easily adjusted by saying that every workplace is fully responsible, and so on and so forth. But once you get into that, the viability of having a temp agency or using a temp agency disappears. So the regulators are saying, we see the risk, we understand it, but there's the business interest. So part of our policy recommendations out of this were that regulators apply stronger incentives and responsibilities to the client employers where the workers are working, and that health and safety inspectors go out and do proactive inspections of workplaces that use temp agency workers. Now just the follow-up, the aftermath, the impact of the study. We had people from the regulators on our advisory committee, so they knew our results very well. So they did a blitz in Ontario of temporary help agencies, only for employment standards, not for health and safety. And they just went into the offices of the agencies, you know, where there's 3 people sitting at the desk and there's no workers because the workers are all out somewhere else. So that strategy looks good, but I don't know how effective it's been. We don't have any evaluations of it, clearly. In Ontario, as a result of this study, we got a call from the Ministry of Labour, and they said, this really helped us to see things. We have to change the act. We're going to make the client employers more responsible. So we're pretty excited about that. It was the Stronger Workplaces for a Stronger Economy Act, except in Ontario we have a minority government that just fell. All the tabled legislation is going to go back, so I don't know, it probably won't go through. So if anyone's interested in more details about this study, we have a web page devoted to it, and we have some publications as well. Thank you.